The clock on the wall ticked past 7 in the evening, its hands marking the hour I had wanted to celebrate a simple, quiet milestone. A modest dinner to honor the years I had spent building a life for my family, filled with sacrifices no one remembered. But the room was emptier than I had dared imagine. Chairs sat vacant around the table, their backs creaking in the stillness as if mocking the silence that swallowed the house whole. The dim light overhead cast long shadows that stretched like fingers across the mahogany surface, and in that hollow quiet, every memory seemed to weigh heavier. I sat alone, the plate before me barely touched, the aroma of food long grown cold in the absence of laughter. The soft ticking of the clock was the only companion demanding my attention. Then, piercing through the thick stillness, my phone shrilled, its harsh rattle an unwelcome summons. I stared at the screen, hesitant. The name blinking back was one I was no longer willing to recognize as trustworthy: Elaine. The coldness in my chest hardened, suspicion blooming instantly like frost on a window pane. I answered. Her voice was sharp, clipped, void of any warmth I once thought deserved. She wasted no time weaving the bitter tale, words laden with deceit, spoken with the icy precision of someone who believed they had conquered me before the battle even began. Financial manipulations, hidden accounts, lies so deeply buried that they ran through years of trust like poison in a vein. The very foundation I had laid with my own hands, the years of careful tending, now reduced to a sordid mess I was barely able to grasp. I felt the air thicken around me, pressing against my lungs, making each breath laborious. My fingers gripped the edge of the table until the knuckles blanched white. The chair beneath me groaned in protest when I finally rose, slow and deliberate. This was more than a betrayal. It was a calculated demolition of all I had built and believed in. The walls of the house seemed to close in, echoing the silence of absent voices, the absence that was louder than anything Elaine's voice had ever been. The laughter that once danced around this room, the affection shared over meals and memories, now a haunting echo, faded into oblivion. I stepped back from the table, each measured footfall absorbed by the heavy carpet. Outside, the evening breeze whispered against the windows, carrying a chill that seemed to seep inside and settle on my skin. I paused near the doorway, a solitary figure framed by shadows, the weight of loss pressing down with relentless gravity. The betrayal was complete, and in that moment, the brokenness of family felt like a silent scream reverberating through the hollow chambers of my heart. Yet, beneath the layers of shock and sorrow, a different sensation stirred, faint but resolute. Though my body ached with the sting of abandonment, my mind began to lock onto something sharper. A quiet promise whispered in the depths of my soul. Justice would find its way. But not tonight. Tonight, I would stand still, absorb the bitter sting, and let the empty chairs around the table remind me of the price I had paid. The story was far from over. In its silence, vengeance was already weaving its first threads. The stillness of the house pressed on me as I retreated to my study, a small sanctuary filled with the remnants of a lifetime's work and memory. Shelves bowed under the weight of dusty books, folders full of blueprints and accounts stacked neatly on the worn desk. The soft, bruising glow of the lamp cast a warm halo, yet even its light couldn't soften the shadows settling deep in my mind. I sank into the chair, tired in body but restless in thought. The betrayal was like a fissure running straight through years of devotion and sacrifice. In the quiet, my mind drifted down the corridors of time, exposing each stone laid carefully one after another. I saw clearly now how every sacrifice I had made had been for others. Tuition paid for my nephew, with hopes I stirred that one day he might stand on his own. The countless nights I spent remodeling the family house, hands raw and aching from holding tools, wanting nothing more than a safe place to nurture bonds that now appeared nothing more than facades. The frail figure of my late wife, her courage and dignity untarnished even as I nursed her through illness, every penny scrimped to see her through the worst. Each of those moments gleamed with the promise of love and loyalty, promises now bitterly broken. It was unbearable, this tally of memories and debts that had turned to ashes in the hands of those I trusted. I recalled the night I'd painstakingly balanced budgets on creased ledger sheets, sweat dampening my brow, thinking of their futures. How many times had I brushed off my own needs, pushed deeper into exhaustion, simply to secure a foundation for them to build upon? And now Elaine, the woman who once wore the mask of sister-in-law, embraced warmly as family, had quietly but with precision pulled the rug from beneath us all. These reflections ignited a fire within me, not raw anger, but something colder, more unforgiving. The understanding was clear. There was no room for naivete anymore, no place for the blind trust that had led to this. I pictured my late wife's smile, faint but steady in my heart. The unyielding principles she stood for, the lessons she imparted about dignity, strength, and fairness. Every penny I had ever saved was a small monument to her memory and to the family she loved so fiercely. This was no longer just about money or assets or the line items in a bank statement. It was an indictment of character, a betrayal that wounded deeper than any physical blow. As the hours stretched, I began to sift through the mental ledger of my life, the sacrifices made, the love given freely, and the debts paid not just in currency, but in loyalty and trust. The stark contrast between the past and present fueled a simmering resolve. The injustice could not stand. I owed it to the memory of my wife, to the integrity I had upheld throughout my life, and to myself to reclaim what was lost. My fingers unconsciously traced the edge of an old photograph resting on the desk. The family, smiles frozen in time, before silence and betrayal fractured what was once whole. The ache was sharp but purposeful. It was in that quiet, unyielding moment that the foundation for what lay ahead took shape. Justice was more than a concept, it was now a mission. From that well of solitude, my mind began to sharpen, sorting through years of knowledge, experience, and the skills accumulated over decades as a civil engineer. I was no stranger to problem solving, to dismantling complex systems piece by piece until their weaknesses revealed themselves. The same patience and precision that once guided beams and structures could now guide me in this new endeavor. This was not a battle fought with brute strength, but with steel-forged strategy. I thought back on the principle I always honored in my profession: design with a margin of safety, anticipate failure points before they occur, and build resilience into every plan. Those principles, long ingrained, now offered a pathway forward. If Elaine and my nephew had seeded their treachery in shadows, I would bring light. If they had twisted numbers and signatures in their favor, I would unravel them methodically, without haste, but without mercy. The evening wore on, and I remained at my desk, piecing together fragments of memory and emerging facts. Legal documents tucked away in drawers, old bank statements, investment portfolios, each a piece of the puzzle waiting to be examined again. What had once been dormant now demanded scrutiny. Yet the scheme was about more than cold figures. It was about restoring a moral balance that had long tilted against me. The quiet fury inside was tempered by a calm resolve and a steady confidence. I was no longer the man who endured in silence. I was the man who would act, with intellect, with deliberation, and with a patience born of long years of knowing the value of a well-laid plan. With each recollection, the image of my family, fractured and betrayed, crystallized the stakes. The love I had given was not an obligation to be squandered by greed disguised as entitlement. It was a sacred trust, a bond that Elaine had twisted into a weapon turned against me. Long after darkness had settled threadbare between the walls of the house, I remained seated, the weight of solitude pressing in but not breaking me. I knew now the path forward would be arduous. that confronting this betrayal demanded more than resentment. It required clarity, precision, and a strategy as sound as any structure I had ever engineered. In the quiet of that night, amidst memories and regrets, a new purpose emerged, a stubborn beacon lighting the way. Justice would not be delivered by chance or emotion. It would be designed, calculated, and executed with the meticulous care that had defined my life. The battle ahead was clear, and I was ready to take the first steps toward reclaiming what had been stolen, not just for myself, but for the honor of everything I had ever sacrificed. Days slipped into nights with a rhythm I no longer noticed. My world narrowed to the document spread out before me and the flickering light that betrayed the late hour. Then came the final blow, the insult wrapped in brevity, a message from my nephew that landed with the sharpness of a whip crack across my wounded spirit. The words were dismissive, even scornful, calling my rightful claim old-fashioned, as if the integrity I'd held sacred were outdated nonsense. The entitlement dripping through his tone was a stark rejection not just of me, but everything I had built. It was a gesture of defiance, an arrogant beacon shining from the ruins they had wrought. But worse still was the confirmation of a fraudulent transfer, a grave act hidden deep beneath layers of false signatures and manipulated ledgers. I stared at the evidence like a betrayed architect witnessing the crumbling of his own foundation. The numbers didn't lie. They clawed at the truth with relentless clarity. It was as if a shadow had gestated in the heart of the family trust, nurtured by betrayal and greed. This revelation was ice poured over any flicker of hope I clung to, the facade of misplaced affection shattered, and with it, any illusions of forgiveness. Sitting in the quiet of my study, tears betrayed me, not of weakness, but of clarity. They traced silent paths down worn cheeks, marking the passage of grief transformed into resolve. I was no man to be undone by sentiment. I was a man refined by hardship and years of quiet endurance. This moment was the crucible where sorrow fused with resolve. I wiped my face and opened the files again, this time not as a man defeated, but as a strategist called to action. The tools I had mastered over decades, the analytical mind, the problem-solving skills honed through countless projects, were now my weapons. There was no room for fury to govern me. I would wield calm precision, as one carefully removing rusted bolts to dismantle a corrupt machine without breaking it prematurely. I thought of every blueprint I had ever drawn, the way each piece supported the next, the importance of balance and timing. This was now the architecture of retribution, built not of steel and concrete, but of evidence and calculated moves. Each document, each carefully preserved email, and each recorded conversation became bricks in the fortress I intended to erect around the truth. There were old contacts to revive, friends made in other spheres of life who had once stood by me during complex contracts and financial mazes. A lawyer who specialized in intricate settlements and a retired banker who once advised me on safeguarding assets were allies I could trust. I cataloged names and numbers, rekindling the threads of a network that had quietly lain dormant but now stirred into action. Their wisdom and experience would complement the knowledge I possessed, creating a layer of strength I lacked alone. I envisioned the strategy taking shape in my mind, like the first lines of a drawing. Priority 1. Freeze the assets tainted by fraud. Cut off the financial arteries Elaine and my nephew relied on to breathe their schemes to life. Priority 2. Expose the web of lies for what it truly was, binding legal audits and investigations into their movements. Priority 3. Prepare the battlefield where the truth would be laid bare, documents presented, and deception stripped to its core. But even as I drafted these steps, I knew vengeance was not a game of haste or emotion. It was a patient siege, a slow unraveling that demands stamina and the ability to foresee every countermove. The past had taught me that pride and anger were flammable fuels, quick to ignite but short-lived. Here I needed endurance, The type that sees through every veil and waits for the moment when the enemy's weaknesses become glaring and impossible to deny. The weight of what was at stake grounded me, yet a thread of satisfaction wound its way beneath the surface. I was no longer a passive victim waiting for others to decide my fate. The roles were shifting, and I was stepping into a space where I commanded with steadiness and resolve. The blueprint of retribution was underway, and I was both engineer and executor. In my mind's eye, I saw Elaine and my nephew scrambling, not with the confidence of the entitled, but with the desperation of being cornered. Their arrogance would buckle under the scrutiny of the evidence I gathered. The house they had built on lies would crack and fall, and I would watch as the truth carried the day. I meticulously began searching digital records, revisiting emails that seemed innocuous at first glance, but under deeper inspection revealed coded conversations, bank statements that showed irregular flows of money, legal documents with signatures that didn't quite match the originals. Each cursor move, each page flicked, was a step deeper into the labyrinth they had tried so unsuccessfully to conceal themselves within. I could almost picture Elaine's face, confident and arrogant when she thought the walls made of lies would never collapse. But every lie has a breaking point, every deceit a chink in the armor. Preserve the original language of my engineering training, the analytical frameworks I had learned to apply to complex systems, the risk assessments, the contingency plans, all became tools in my mental arsenal to dismantle their scheme. My life had been about structure, stability, and foresight. Now it was about weaponizing those same principles against the betrayal that threatened to consume everything I held dear. Late that night, as the house settled into silence and the city outside faded into dreams, I sat alone, the glow of the lamp a tiny beacon among the shadows. The solitude was no longer a prison, it was my forge. Here, in the quiet, the slow burn of purpose ignited into a steadfast flame. I stood once more, this time with the clarity of a man who knew where he was headed. The path was daunting, the battle ahead as complex and exacting as any structure I had ever designed. But I was ready to draw the lines in the sand, to hold to every principle, and to reclaim not only my legacy, but the dignity that had been stolen. Justice, I realized, was not a sudden thunderclap. It was a patient, inevitable force, and I would be its architect. The moment I embraced the role of strategist, everything shifted. The fog of betrayal and despair that had once clouded my vision thinned, giving way to a laser focus fueled by years of disciplined thinking and an unwavering commitment to justice. I was no longer simply a victim licking wounds. I was a calculated force, poised to dismantle the deceit that had threatened to unravel the very fabric of the family I had devoted my life to. I began by returning to the tangible, the cold, hard documents that whispered secrets in the dim light of my study. Bank statements became maps, guiding me through a maze of illicit transfers and fabricated debts. Each line of numbers, each notation scribbled in the margins was an invitation to dig deeper. From whispered rumors of unusual financial decisions to glaring inconsistencies hidden in shriveled pages marked by time, the evidence bloomed before my eyes like a detailed blueprint of corruption. I'd known Elaine as a woman who masked ambition with charm, a chameleon skilled in weaving herself into the hearts of others with practiced ease. But the woman who wielded the family trust like a weapon was a stranger to me, as cold and calculating as a winter sunrise. Her greed was insatiable, and her conviction in entitlement arrogant beyond belief. And yet, her folly was her overconfidence, the same overconfidence that would soon unravel the fortress she had spent so long building. Armed with the skills developed over decades as a civil engineer, I set out to map the weaknesses in their intricate web. My mind, trained to understand the nuances of load-bearing structures and hidden faults, found parallels in the twisted financial architecture forged by Elaine and my nephew. Fraudulent debts appeared not as single missteps, but as artfully constructed pillars designed to collapse the entire edifice when least expected. I spread out old contracts, investment portfolios, and tax records across the desk, juxtaposing them against digital correspondence and recorded phone calls I had begun to collect quietly. It was meticulous work, akin to tightening the bolts of a delicate machine, where one wrong twist could snap the entire system. Patience was key. Haste would breed mistakes, and in my experience, the most devastating fall comes from unnoticed cracks left ignored. To confront such deviancy, I needed allies, a small but formidable circle of professionals who could bring their expertise to bear in this quiet war. I reached out to Jonathan, a lawyer whose insight into complex family settlements was precise and unsparing. Our shared history of battles fought in courtrooms and negotiations made him a reliable partner for the battles ahead. There was also Margaret, a former banker turned financial advisor, renowned for her uncanny ability to detect anomalies in fiscal reports and transactions. Their experience complemented my own, offering tools and perspectives I could not fully wield alone. Emails and phone conversations needed to be cross-checked, timelines reconstructed, and motives laid bare beneath the cold light of evidence. I compiled every scrap of communication that suggested collusion, statements where tone betrayed deception, subtle shifts in language revealing purposeful omission. Like a gathering storm, the dossier grew, weaving a coherent narrative of calculated fraud, betrayal, and brazen entitlement. We devised a multi-layered plan. First, freeze the assets under Elaine and my nephew's control, sealing off their access to funds moved in bad faith. This was no simple procedure. It required legal finesse and swift coordination with banks and regulatory agencies. I employed every contact I had maintained over the years, bank managers, auditors, officials in financial oversight bodies, and rekindled connections forged in the crucible of previous projects and shared trust. Next came the exposure, orchestrating audits that would peel back the layers of fiscal obfuscation and reveal the true scale of the betrayal. Unreported income, staged withdrawals, forged signatures, each allegation was supported with irrefutable documentation. We uncovered tax irregularities that had provided a cover for their financial maneuvers, establishing a pattern of deception that extended beyond just the family trust. Finally, preparation for the inevitable legal confrontation required a dossier refined to a razor's edge. Every recorded conversation, every paper trail, every digital footprint was painstakingly organized, annotated, and cross-referenced. The dossier was intended not merely as evidence, but as a weapon of accountability, a statement of magnitude that would dismantle the antagonist narrative and expose their greed and entitlement in full. Throughout this process, my mind often wandered back to the foundations of my life, the sacrifices embedded in each brick of our home, the late nights spent balancing both budgets and hope, the quiet care I gave to my late wife through illness, and the tuition I paid so that my nephew might one day rise on his own merit. These memories were both fuel and compass, reminding me that this was not simply a battle over numbers, but a fight to reclaim respect and restore a fracturing moral order. Yet, with the strategizing came echoes of loneliness. I felt the weight of every decision, every step forward taken in calculated silence. The absence of laughter around the table was a constant reminder that this was a war born of fractured trust, broken by those once close. The tension built steadily as I realized the true cost of betrayal was measured not only in lost currency, but in damaged relationships and severed bonds. Still, I refused to let bitterness dictate my actions. Each plan was crafted with an engineer's care, calm, precise, and unfaltering. My resolve grew stronger as I imagined the inevitable moment when truth would illuminate the shadows they had hidden within. I pictured Elaine's and my nephew's faces as their carefully constructed facades crumbled under scrutiny. not with rage or desperation, but with the inevitability of long-accumulated evidence brought to light. In the quiet moments between the flurry of work, my thoughts returned to justice itself, the principle that had guided my life quietly yet firmly. Justice was no fleeting act of retribution. It was the restoration of balance and honor. It was a rebuilding, akin to the projects I had overseen with meticulous dedication and an unyielding belief that every joint, every being, must be solid. This was my purpose now, to restore what had been stolen, not just in assets, but in dignity and truth. I worked with painstaking detail, aware that each misstep could cost me the outcome I yearned for. The plan was layered, iterative, and thorough, designed to outlast the cunning of the few and steady enough to withstand the storms of resistance that would inevitably rise. I spent long hours studying the vulnerabilities in the financial and legal structures corrupted by Elaine and my nephew. Every point of failure I could identify became a lever to pry loose their hold on the fortune built with such care over a lifetime. Combined with the support of Jonathan and Margaret, I assembled a framework where each part reinforced the other, a network of legal action, fiscal oversight, and unassailable proof. Some nights, when exhaustion threatened to claim me, I recalled my wife's steadfast gaze, the quiet strength she exemplified even in pain. It was her spirit that steadied me, reminding me why I endured beyond anger or despair. My efforts were not for vengeance born of cruelty, but to reclaim a life dedicated to honor and to the memory of love that refused to be silenced. The house was silent around me as the plan unfolded, brick by brick, document by document. I felt the steady pulse of control returning, the tide of determination rising with every calculated step. The orbit of betrayal might have seemed complete, but I was the unseen force disrupting it, the architect of a justice both inevitable and impartial. In this quiet mastery of design and strategy, I found a strange peace. The path ahead was long, a maze filled with obstacles and resistance. Yet I was ready, for this was my moment, the convergence of a lifetime's experience and a present's hard-earned clarity. This was no longer a story of loss. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And in the quiet, the plan began to breathe, alive with promise, with resolve, and with the unyielding spirit of a man who would see justice restored and arrogance punished. When the first move was made, it was almost imperceptible, a slight shift in the currents beneath what Elaine and my nephew believed was their secure dominion. The freezing of accounts, the revocation of credit lines, the initiation of official complaints within financial regulatory agencies. All were calculated strikes designed not to provoke but to suffocate their capacity to maneuver. I watched from the sidelines, the calm eye in the storm, as the reaction unfolded. The ripple became a wave of confusion and quiet panic. Suddenly, the easy flow of funds that had sustained their ruse stopped cold. Emails flew frantically. Phone calls were made behind closed doors. Their composure cracked. Yet their desperation was cloaked in a veneer of aggressive indignation, a last-ditch effort to reclaim control and to paint me the antagonist. What followed were confrontations that I welcomed, for they signaled that my strategy had struck a nerve. I met Elaine's steely glare in terse meetings where accusations and defenses volleyed back and forth like harsh gusts of wind through a crumbling building. She unleashed sharp words, armed with the arrogance born of her supposed invulnerability. But her fury was blunted by years of my quiet patience. I responded only with measured calm, letting her rage expose the desperation she could no longer fully disguise. My nephew's posture changed as well, from a scornful disregard to a careful, guarded wariness. He confronted me once, voice raised in frantic defense of claimed rights, resorting to bitterness and the indignation of youth corrupted by entitlement. My replies were unyielding yet devoid of anger. Each word was chosen to undermine, not inflame, to show that the times of blind trust were over and that every layer of deceit had been penetrated. It was here I realized that vengeance, unlike anger, is precise. It is not about shouting louder, but about standing firmer. My strength lay in calm endurance, in the knowledge that each legal procedure, each frozen asset, and each exposed lie added weight to the inevitable collapse of their defenses. I could feel the structure of their deceit weakening, not through fury, but through the steady, calculated pressure of evidence and consequence. The battles were not always public. They often unfolded in the silence of courtrooms, in the confidential exchanges of legal firms, and in the quiet offices of financial regulators. Yet I was always present, a silent architect directing the flow, orchestrating each step with the meticulous care of a seasoned engineer. Every frozen account was another beam removed from the crumbling edifice. Every complaint filed was a carefully placed wedge forcing the cracks to widen. Friends and allies rallied quietly in the background. Jonathan's sharp legal mind turned the amassed evidence into indictments that held formidable weight, while Margaret's financial acumen uncovered new layers of fiscal irregularities, presenting challenges that Elaine and my nephew struggled to counter. Their professional rigor steadied my resolve, proving invaluable in translating data and documents into an unassailable narrative of deceit. While the process was grueling and protracted, the moments of triumph, quiet though they might be, were profoundly satisfying. The first legal audit began to uncover previously hidden discrepancies. Banks initiated investigations of their own, halting suspicious transactions. The landscape was shifting beneath my betrayer's feet. I watched as their once confident assertions faltered under mounting pressure. The escalation of legal notices, regulatory inquiries, and financial blockades created cracks in their facade. In private conversations leaked to me by unwilling accomplices, I heard whispers of fear and frustration. Elaine, once a woman who believed herself untouchable, was now afraid, her sharp tongue silenced by the tightening noose. One evening, as I reviewed the latest bank statements that reflected frozen assets and blocked transfers, I allowed myself a rare smile. The victory was not yet complete, but this was the first undeniable sign that the tide was turning. The quiet patience of years, woven into a tapestry of legal and financial strategy, was eroding the arrogance that had seemed so impregnable. The confrontations became more frequent and direct. I faced them with the stoicism honed over decades, careful never to reveal the storm that brewed beneath. There were moments when Elaine attempted to provoke me, sharp insults aimed at breaking my composure, but I remained unmoved, my face a fortress of dignity. The fury she sought did not manifest. My control was my power. At times, I caught glimpses of genuine fear in her eyes, a recognition of the consequences she had brought upon herself. The empire built on greed and betrayal was crumbling, and though her desperation spiked, it only hastened her downfall. My nephew's bluster became guarded strategy as he realized the walls were closing in. Even as the family's fractures deepened and those who once sided with them retreated into silence or dissociation, I maintained focus on the larger aim, not merely punishment, but restoration. Every legal filing that returned favorable, every financial institution that cooperated in halting illicit activity was a step toward reclaiming not just property, but the honor that had been violated. Behind closed doors, I spent hours coordinating with my allies, ensuring that no loophole remained open, no evidence left unexamined, no avenue unavailable to reinforce our position. The complexity of the task often felt overwhelming, but the clear progression in dismantling their control fueled a steady flame of determination. There were nights when fatigue tugged at my resolve, when the silence of the house felt heavy and the memory of past warmth and trust seemed painfully distant. Yet even in those moments, the guiding light in my heart glimmered still, the unwavering belief that justice was not only necessary, but inevitable. I thought often of the sacrifices that had paved the way to this struggle, the quietly paid tuitions, the nights spent nursing my wife, the labor poured into making this house a home. Each effort had been a stone in the foundation of our family, a foundation now threatened but not irreparably damaged. As the weeks passed, the consequences of my actions became painfully clear to Elaine and my nephew. Their freedom to move assets and influence families fractured, as they realized they were no longer masters of a game, but participants facing a formidable adversary who knew every rule and exploited every weakness. In those moments, I reaffirmed my belief in a justice grounded not in vengeance as a mere act of emotional retaliation, but in a reasoned, patient, and precise reclaiming of what had been stolen. The sting of betrayal was no longer a consuming fire, but a tempered blaze, guiding each step with unwavering resolve. The execution of the plan moved steadily forward, with calculated moves replacing rash reactions, and my quiet fury unfolding in the measured, unyielding steps of legal processes, regulatory actions, and financial interventions. Gradually, the walls of deception were forced to crumble, piece by piece, until the house built on lies could stand no more, and the truth emerged, clear and undeniable, from the ruins. The day of the final confrontation loomed with a weight that seemed to fill every crack and shadow of the family attorney's office. The air inside was thick, not with warmth or comfort, but with the tension that only long-repressed truths and bitter betrayals can summon. It was a room that had witnessed countless negotiations, agreements, and disputes, but none bore the gravity of this moment, a collision course set over years of silence finally reaching its apex. Settled calmly in my chair, the dossier in front of me was no mere collection of papers. It was a meticulously crafted chronicle of deception, painstakingly assembled with the precision of an engineer drawing the last lines of a blueprint. Every page, every annotated note, every forensic accounting report was a testament to patience and unyielding resolve. This was not vengeance fueled by bitterness, but a reasoned, deliberate unveiling of truth laid bare for all present. Elaine sat across the room. Preserve the original language of accumulated evidence. There was a coldness in her eyes that belied the uncertainty flickering beneath. Her demeanor shifted subtly as the layers of fraud and manipulation unfolded openly before the room. Years of confidence built upon deception were now threatened, and the facade showed signs of strain. Beside her, my nephew's usual defiant front had softened into an uneasy wariness. His youthful arrogance, once so brazen in dismissing my concerns, diminished under the unrelenting spotlight of facts. The veneer of entitlement he had worn was wearing thin, the reality of his complicity settling like a shadow over his features. The attorney, a man seasoned by the countless undercurrents of family disputes, guided the proceedings with a measured, authoritative voice. His opening remarks framed the depth and breadth of the claims, signaling the seriousness with which the gathered evidence had been prepared. With each document I presented, the room seemed to grow quieter, the air thicker with the undeniable presence of revealed truths. Forensic accountants spoke with clinical detachment, guiding the attendees through a labyrinth of falsified transactions, hidden assets, and manipulated contracts. Their findings painted a comprehensive picture of calculated betrayal, exposing the tactics that had siphoned trust and resources from the very hands meant to protect them. Elaine attempted to counter with pointed, rehearsed objections, questions and insinuations intended to sow doubt, but her efforts faltered against the weight of corroborated evidence. The room, full of lawyers, witnesses, and observers, remained anchored to the facts I had laid out. Unfolding before them was the story of a family trust corrupted by greed, and a web of lies unraveling under scrutiny. Witnesses, experts called upon to bolster the revelations, preserved the original language of the text employed to hide the misappropriations. Their testimonies offered vivid accounts of how carefully the financial manipulations had been concealed, of signature forgeries, coaxed confidences, and misrepresentations designed to obscure the truth. Each voice added another layer of undeniable clarity, cementing the narrative of treachery. When it came my turn to speak, I let the weight of years fill my words. I recounted not only the legal infringements, but the human cost, the silent sacrifices hidden beneath the layers of broken trust. I spoke of the tuition I had paid for my nephew, the hands worn rough renovating the home now tainted by deceit, the nights spent by my late wife's bedside nurturing love amid pain. These were not mere anecdotes. They were the underpinning of a life dedicated to family, now cheapened by callous betrayal. My voice was steady, unwavering. Yet beneath the calm lay an ocean of emotion that years of restraint had tempered but not extinguished. I demanded not only financial restitution, but the restoration of dignity that had been eroded by years of quiet treason. This was a moment of reckoning, a final assertion of truth against the shadow of falsehood lingering too long in our lives. As I spoke, I saw the cracks deepen in Elaine's mask of composure. The confidence that once shielded her now gave way to unease, to fleeting moments where doubt and fear flickered across her eyes. My nephew, less guarded, looked away, caught in the suffocating grip of accountability. The attorney's careful guidance underscored the gravity of the charges and the imperatives of justice. Outside, I was aware that the tentative support of family members and friends had already been eroded. Those who once sided with Elaine and my nephew in whispers and uncertain loyalties now distanced themselves, unwilling to taint their images with association as the damning evidence rose clear and undeniable. The isolation that descended was both a symptom and a confirmation of their unraveling facade. Despite the victory steadily mounting within that solemn room, I sensed the complex emotions weaving beneath the surface. Relief mingled with sadness, triumphs laced with the lingering sting of broken bonds. This was not a celebration, but a somber acknowledgement of a painful chapter reaching its close. The closing moments demanded from me a final testament, not merely of what had been lost, but of what remained resilient. I spoke with the quiet power of someone who had endured and emerged with dignity intact. I reclaimed the narrative, not as a man broken by betrayal, but as one strengthened by resolve and a deep-rooted commitment to justice. The documents and testimonies assembled were more than legal proof. They were a restoration of truth, a public affirmation that the sacrifices of a lifetime could not be cast aside or rendered meaningless by greed. In holding Elaine and my nephew accountable, I reclaimed not just what was stolen, but the fractured spirit of family itself. When the meeting adjourned, the heavy silence that followed was not emptiness, but the fullness of closure. The burden I had carried settled softly, replaced by a cautious hope that what had been broken might begin to heal. The journey had been long and arduous, scarred by pain, but within that stillness I found a deep and abiding peace. Walking away from the table where so much had been contested, I carried with me a new reality. The house that had once echoed with betrayal now stood on the cusp of a restored foundation, one reinforced not by deception but by the unwavering strength of truth and patient justice. I was no longer defined by the wounds inflicted, but by the measured resilience that had guided me through the storm. The past would always be etched in memory, but the future beckoned with the promise of honor reclaimed and dignity restored. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the remnants of shattered illusions and rebuilt trust, I understood the true magnitude of what had been achieved. The battle was not only won, it was a testament to the enduring power of steadfast conviction, of justice pursued with unwavering clarity, and of a man who refused to be silenced. This was more than the conclusion of a dispute. It was the birth of a new chapter, a chapter where silence yielded to truth, where betrayal met its reckoning, and where the quiet dignity of a life built on sacrifice found its rightful place once more. The house settled into a deep, almost contemplative silence the night after the final confrontation. I found myself once again in my study, the familiar walls closed in around me like a long-lost embrace. The weight on my chest, heavy for so long, had finally lightened, not because wounds had vanished, but because the truth had been laid bare, the injustice met with patient strength. I sat alone, the quiet not a void but a space filled with reflection. The house seemed emptier now. The laughter and warmth of the past were distant memories, shadows that lingered but did not oppress. The faces of those who had chosen betrayal were absent, the hollow spaces they left reminding me of the cost borne when trust is fractured beyond repair. Yet, despite the hollowness, there was a paradoxical purity in this solitude, a cleansing of falsehoods and pretenses. In that stillness, I allowed myself to contemplate the journey, years marked by sacrifice that had once felt invisible, unrewarded. I thought again of my wife, her steady resolve through hardship, the quiet strength she modeled even as illness seeped into our lives. My heart revisited the countless moments when love was measured not in grand gestures but in everyday endurance. Now, as the bitterness receded, those moments shone with a clear, unwavering light. I understood, with the clarity born of struggle, that justice had never been merely about reclaiming what was taken. It was about restoring the honor that theft of trust and dignity had threatened to erase. It was about ensuring that the legacy of sacrifice and integrity would remain untouched by greed or arrogance. The betrayals had fractured the family, leaving rifts that time may never fully mend. Yet the reckoning had drawn definitive lines in this fractured landscape, a clear statement that loyalty must be earned and that trust, once broken, carries consequences not only financial but moral. Elaine and my nephew's choices had isolated them. Their defiance crumbled into silence where support once dwelled. They were left to navigate the ruins of a trust they had destroyed. For me, the days that followed were quieter, yet filled with a new resolve. I embraced a cautious freedom, not reckless or naive, but tempered by the lessons learned. The dignity I reclaimed was no fleeting triumph. It was a sobriety, a foundation upon which I could rebuild a life defined not by betrayal, but by steadfastness. I found solace in routine, in the simple pleasures that once seemed overshadowed by conflict. The garden outside, touched by morning light, became a place of quiet meditation. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the turning of a well-read book's pages, the soft creak of chairs. The house, once a space of tension, slowly breathed with life again. Though the family was irrevocably changed, I held to a hope, fragile perhaps, but persistent, that wounds might heal, that understanding could one day bridge the divides forged in pain. But more than that, I held firm to the conviction that silence would no longer serve as a refuge for injustice. The empty chairs at the table were stark reminders of what had been lost, but they also stood as a testament to resilience, a symbol that my worth was never held in the presence or absence of others, but in the integrity and labor that had built this life. I no longer sought validation from those who had dismissed me. My own reflection was enough. In this new reality, I embraced a calm vigilance. There was peace in knowing I had acted not out of bitterness, but with the steady hand of justice, a justice that had restored balance and punished arrogance with the quiet force of truth. I had built more than walls and ledgers. I had built a life anchored in enduring principles, longer than the reach of those who sought to cast shadows over it. As daylight filtered through the window, I whispered quietly to myself, a final affirmation of the journey. These empty chairs will never hold my worth again. The past had shaped me. The betrayal had tested me, but they would no longer define me. Ahead lay a horizon unshackled by silence and strengthened by the serene strength of a man who had endured, reclaimed, and now stood quietly unbreakable.